Okay guys, today I'm going to show you how to clean the throttle body and the idle air control motor on a fuel injected vehicle. We're going to do this on a 4.2 liter Ford Econoline van, but the process is going to be very similar on all makes and models. First we're going to locate the intake tract, and on the van we got to take all this stuff off to get to the throttle body. So we'll start by just removing all these pieces. They just kind of pop apart on the vans. So you'll see there's the air cleaner and everything all coming off in one piece. Then after we get that off, we'll loosen this clamp. This big barrel thing here is the mass airflow sensor, and the mass airflow sensor is telling the computer how much air is actually being drawn into the engine, and it's a very important part of engine function, and it's also very delicate. So you want to make sure that you take care in not jarring this thing around too much, or touching anything that may be on the inside of it. On the GM cars and stuff, you'll see the little wires hanging on the inside, and they're very delicate, so make sure you don't touch those. They do sell mass airflow sensor cleaners, but I've seen mass airflow sensors with 400,000 miles on them that haven't had anything wrong with them, and I wouldn't suggest cleaning them because you could damage them. They're very delicate, like I said. So I'm just finishing up taking the mounting bolts out. On these Fords, there's 4 bolts, these 2 up here and the 2 that I've already taken out. So we'll just take those out the rest of the way. And then I'm going to grab it and gently pull it apart. And then you got to take the connector off that's connected to the mass airflow sensor. You'll just depress a little button and it'll pull right out. Then you set that off to the side. And I like to install bolts a lot of times when you're working on stuff. If you just have bolts that are coming out and you know they're not going to get in the way, you can just go ahead and reinstall those so that when you put it back together, you'll know how everything goes back together. So the next thing now is just to take the rest of this intake apart. We're going to take it apart in one piece, first by just removing this one clamp, and this is the intake air temperature sensor connector, which we'll remove here in a minute. So first we'll loosen this clamp. Then once the clamp is loose, we'll just kind of give it a little pull and wobble, and then we'll depress the button on the connector, and I'll use a flathead screwdriver and just lightly pry on it. Now I make those connectors all look easy. They're difficult at first, and on all different makes and models those things will be different. Don't forget about this little breather tube on these 4.2 liters. But the connectors will be different. You'll have to be careful with those. You don't want to break them. So just study them out, and like I said, they're all different, but they're pretty simple to take apart. So I set the wires out of the way. Now we got to get this throttle body cover off. I'm just going to use the socket and go ahead and go in here and break that thing loose. And I'll just pull it off, and then I'm going to also reinstall that bolt just so that I know where it goes whenever I have to put it back together. Now this is the throttle body, and you can see here when I'm moving this is actually what you would be doing if you're giving the car gas. You can see the 2 cables to the right. Those are actually the gas pedal and the cruise control cable, and those, like I said, those pull on the throttle body and open it up. And the thing over here to the left is the throttle position sensor. Now that's reading where or how much gas you're giving the engine, so that the computer can add more fuel by spraying more fuel with the fuel injectors. Now you see these things come off really easy. You just kind of pull back on it and wobble it, it'll come out. And the other connector just pulls back, and you see how it was just clipped in. And now this connector, basically just like all the rest of them, I'm going to use a flathead screwdriver, and I'll depress the button again with my thumb and just gently pry on the back side of it. Now we'll locate the 4 mounting bolts of the throttle body. This is pretty standard for all cars. Although some cars, like I have a 95 Camaro that has an LT1 motor in it, and it has a twin blade throttle body, but it still will mount basically the same way. So you'll just take the 4 bolts out. Then once you get those out, usually these throttle bodies are stuck pretty good, so you'll have to just give a little tap with a hammer. And I'm tapping on a thick piece of the aluminum so that I'm not going to break anything, because the casting is pretty delicate and they're very expensive. And you can see the dirt on the back side of it, which is pretty typical of a motor like this with 150,000 miles on it. Same with the intake passage here. And you can see this little hole, that is the idle air control motor passage. That is actually where the motor is drawing air at the idle to control the RPM of the idle. You can see just the little bit of dirt here, which also is just a pretty common occurrence. So here's the idle air control motor. And I'm just going to break the 2 bolts loose on it. And if you're new with the connectors, I'd suggest to remove the electrical connector first, because they're tricky to remove, especially on this thing, because it's way up under the cowl and it's hard to reach. And if you're having trouble reaching this stuff, I'd suggest standing on something, and you can get a few more inches of reach up in here. I'm making it look kind of easy, but I'm pretty used to working on these. So you see, I just use the screwdriver and just lightly pry it off while pushing the button down to pop that connector off. And then this is your idle air control motor. And you can see on the top hole there, the little pintle, that thing actually will move back and forth, and that's going to allow more or less air to flow into the engine at the idle, which will keep it running. This is the throttle body cleaner, the gasket scraper, and the toothbrush that we're going to use to clean the throttle body and also remove the gasket from the throttle body. So first you have to scrape the old gasket material off of the throttle body. Now this is tricky, especially on the Fords. You want to choke up real close on the gasket scraper and be very careful not to gouge the aluminum too much, because you don't want to cause an air leak here or the engine will not run properly. So you can see I'm just very carefully scraping a little piece at a time, and I'm scraping away from my body so I don't cut my fingers off or anything. And you want to do this, like I said, until the whole surface is clean and smooth. And we'll have to do the same thing on the intake surface too, that's on the engine, to make sure that both surfaces are clean before they're mounted back together. So you can see here I'm just cleaning with the throttle body cleaner and using the toothbrush to get into all the little holes. The only 2 parts, like I said earlier, that we're going to use are 2 gaskets that are both only a couple bucks each. So this is a really cheap job. And the only other thing that you'd really have to buy is the throttle body cleaner. And the reason that I'm not using gasoline is because the throttle body cleaner is safe for the sensors. Now you can see here I was just pointing to the surface that had to be clean. You can see where I've scraped it now, it's pretty clean. And I'm just going to use the toothbrush just to put some of the throttle body cleaner on it to eat away any of the remaining gasket material. So now that I've got it all sprayed out, and I just kind of dabbed it real lightly with a rag, making sure I didn't leave any rag debris behind. That looks pretty clean. Then we're ready to reinstall. And you can see the gasket on the Ford has a triangle on one side and it's ovate on the other. That's just kind of showing gasket orientation. So on the Ford, for some reason, even though the gasket looked like it would go on both ways, they wanted it on a certain way. So just pay attention to that whenever you're taking them apart. And now it's time to just reassemble everything. And I'd like to use a anti-seize lubricant on all the bolts so that if I ever have to take this stuff apart in the future, it'll all come right apart and rust and corrosion won't be a problem. So now to get this thing on, this is the idle air control motor. I got the gasket on there. I'm holding it with my fingers. Make sure that the gasket's lined up. That's very important, to make sure you've got the gasket oriented properly and it's lined up. And then I'm just going to put one bolt in first and screw that in a little bit, and then I'll go ahead and put the other bolt in. And as I'm tightening those bolts down, I'm going to keep them tightening down in an even fashion so that one side doesn't get pulled tighter than the other, or I may have a vacuum leak at this location, which will cause a rough idle, and it'll cause a rough running situation at any RPM. So the motor will not run right if this is not put on properly. And then I'll just tighten that down. Now this is all pretty simple, and this is stuff that just a basic home do-it-yourselfer can do. You're not really getting into anything too crazy on the inside of the engine by doing this stuff, and this is all just pretty much general maintenance on any fuel-injected vehicle. So for all the connectors, I'm going to use dielectric grease. I like to put this on all of my electrical connections that I work on, and this ensures that no water or anything will get into the connection and cause the sensors to malfunction. So you see I just put a little bit on there and just plugged it in, and now I'm going to make sure that my gas lines up. And once you know that your gasket is proper and it's going to line up, you can go ahead and just slide that on. And then for all 4 bolts, I'm going to use the anti-seize lubricant on all of those. Actually, on the Ford, you can see there's 2 of them that are nuts. The 2 that I've just installed are actually both nuts, and then the other 2 are bolts. Here's one of the bolts. And then here's the last one. And then to tighten them down, I tighten them in a crisscrossed fashion so that it gets a good even tightening on the gasket, so that I prevent a vacuum leak at this location. Like I said, it's very important that this is sealed very well. So I'm just crossing from one to the other and just tightening a little more and more each time. Then I'll put a little bit of dielectric grease on my connection and plug the throttle position sensor back in. And then it's time to put the throttle cables on. I just use a little bit of oil, put that across the spring just so that the spring always stays free moving. And I'm also going to put a little bit here on the throttle cables, just because they do move in and out a lot, and it's not really something that wears out, but it's something that moves, and this keeps it moving freely. Now I just put a little drop there just so that you'll see here in a second why this simply just slides in, and this other one you'll see kind of clicks in. So that's why I put a little bit of oil on it, just to help it pop in. And then all that's done. Then we can just reinstall the cover. I've already taken the bolt back out that I put in earlier. And then I'm going to slide that in. I have dielectric grease on it, or anti-seize on it, and I'm going to screw that down. And then once that's down, we can start installing the intake. So we'll put the elbow on first. Just wobble that on. Make sure we install the breather, and we will take the this is the mass airflow connector, the mass airflow sensor connector, and the intake air temperature sensor connector. So I'm going to put some dielectric grease on both of those. Then once I've done that, I can tighten up my clamp. Then once I'm happy with the tightness of the clamp, I'll go ahead and remove the bolts that I put back in, and I'm going to anti-seize those so that if I have to take the mass airflow sensor off in the future, I won't have a problem getting these bolts out. And there, you can see I was just pointing to show you that you don't want to touch anything in there if you can help it. Stay away from all that, and just go ahead and gently plug it in. And the mass airflow sensor mounts into these little rubber washers, so you might have to wobble it around a little bit, and you'll get your bolts started. So I'll start those top two, and then we'll come down here and to the bottom two. Then we'll run those in. Now, like I said, they sell mass airflow sensor cleaner, but I've seen them with 400,000 miles on them, and they were problem-free. And I'd honestly be afraid to spray anything on them because they're expensive and they're pretty delicate. So if you think you might have a problem with them, it might be a problem with the wiring or something like that, maybe rubbing on something. And this clamp here is pretty important, so you want to make sure. You see, I tightened it, but I ended up right here loosening it and just pushing it on a little bit more. So you want to make sure that you got those clamps all tightened, especially these here after the mass airflow sensor, or the computer is going to be getting an inaccurate reading of how much air it's taking in. And then you don't want to forget to plug in the connector. You can see my dielectric grease on it. Okay, and then it's time to reinstall the air cleaner. On the Fords, it's real simple. You just kind of wobble it in, and once you get it in place, just tighten the clamp down. And then you can put the last piece of the intake track on, and that's it. Now the tools that we used were the throttle body cleaner and oil. We used the dielectric grease and the anti-seize, the screwdriver and the gasket scraper, the toothbrush, the ratchet and sockets we used, and the hammer. Now the flashlight and the little mirror would be for if you had to get behind something or just if you needed help seeing anything. So that's pretty much it. If you guys have any questions, just feel free to ask me, and thanks for watching my video.